Hi, today's beginner's tutorial is going to be just doing these few simple autumn leaves. I've drawn 3 here and this one in the centre is going to be my focal point. I've drawn the lines a little bit stronger than I would normally. Normally I do them quite faint just so that I can see them and that they don't show too much through the finished painting, but I've put a little bit more pressure on so that you can see the lines there on the camera. Now, one question I get asked a lot by beginners with the watercolour painting is, do you do the background first or the subject first? And the answer to that really is, it's entirely up to you. What I prefer to do is I do the background first because I like to keep that quite loose and simple so that the focus is on the subject. Other people do it the other way around. So just, you know, what works best for you is the answer to that. So how I'm going to tackle it is I'm going to start by wetting the paper all over behind the subject, but not wetting the leaves. And I'll just for that use quite a biggish brush so that we can get that done quite quickly. So some nice clean water. And with my water pots, I've actually got 2 pots so that one is clean water for applying to the paper and applying to your paint, and the other one is for washing your brush. And I do change my water quite often, so that's a good tip for you, is to keep changing your water, and then it's nice and clean and you get you know, we rely on the white of the paper coming through in watercolour, so we don't want muddy water. I'm not going to go right up to the edge of the paper, I'm just going to put it in a little bit of a frame there, go to about there somewhere. Okay, so I've covered that with water apart from the leaves. Now when you do this, obviously you can't see your water, so if you want to see if you've missed any bits, just tilt your head on one side, and any bits of paper that look dull, you can see them compared to the shiny bits that you've put water on. And so the dull bits, if there are any, you might want to just go over them again with a little bit of extra water, but that's looking okay. Okay, so for the background I'm going to keep it really simple. So I'm going to start and put a nice bright yellow in the background. So I'm going to go for a gamboge. And this all needs to be done whilst this paper is still wet. So I've got some gamboge there and I'm just popping it in randomly into the background. A nice bright painting. But don't forget with your watercolour, if you're new to watercolour, they do dry a lot lighter than they go on. So this yellow won't be as bright once this painting's completely dry. Okay, so that's nice. Just get a bit of colour in to begin with. I'll just clean that brush a bit better. So the next colour, I think we're going to go for some blue. And something quite bright as well, I think. Nice turquoisey colour. And just dropping it in, not mixing it too much on the paper. The only places I'm really painting is when I'm going around. But because the leaf is dry, because you've gone around the leaves when you've been putting the water on, you shouldn't have too many problems with it running over onto the leaf area. And it doesn't matter where it's mixing because you've got some nice greens appearing there. So this is completely imaginary background. It could be some more leaves in the distance. It could be the sun coming through, a little bit of sky, it could be anything, because it's all going to fade and become much lighter. Can you see how although this is quite a big brush, because it goes into such a nice point, you can get into those corners with it. So, you know, you don't need to swap brushes to such a small brush. Start off with as big a brush as you can manage. Your paintings will be a lot looser and freer if you work with as big a brush as you can manage to begin with, and then just use your smaller brushes for the last bits of detail. And I think it just wants a little bit of blue actually. Popping into this yellow, which is perhaps a bit too big a piece on its own there. And if you think it's a bit bright and you want it to move around a little bit more, you can always give it a little squirt of water. So if you're new to watercolour and you haven't got one of these, this is a good thing to have, a little squirty bottle. You don't have to go to the art shop and buy a special one. You can, you know, the ones that you can squirt your face with to cool down, that they sell in the chemist. You could buy one of those, or you could use something that's had a product in it, you know, maybe a cosmetic or a cleaning product. So one of those is really useful, and a nice fine mist if you can. Okay, so that's nice because it's where I've squirted it. I mean, you don't have to squirt it, you could leave it as it was before, but I just wanted it to be a bit softer. So where I've squirted it, can you see it's moving around a little here? And actually those are some quite nice shapes, because the imagination could make those into some leaves and flowers in the background, in the far distance, skies, clouds, anything really. So all I'm going to do now is leave this to completely dry. And then I'll come back and go on to the next part, filling the leaves in. Okay, so as you can see, that's completely dry now. I shouldn't really put my hand down that way, that's not a good way to teach you. When you check in to see if something's dry, use the back of your hand so that you're not putting any oil off your hand onto your painting. And again, like I said before, if you want to check that it's dry, tilt your head to one side, look at the paper across the paper, and if you see any glistening, you can see that it's still damp and you need to leave it a little bit longer. Before I carry on, I should just have said when I began what paper we were using here. So this is Langton, Daler and Rowley, and it's £140. And as you can see there, I've popped paper clips, bulldog clips at the edge to stop the paper curling up, because it's not such a heavy paper, and it would curl up with all that amount of water if we didn't put those there. So just checking that you're still in shot. Okay, so we'll go ahead now and start painting these leaves. So I'm going to go for a smaller brush now, and again one with a nice point on the end, and I'm just going to start by putting some water into this first leaf, filling the whole thing once again just with water like we did with the background. I mean, you could, if you like, just this technique that I'm using when we paint, wet the paper first, is called wet into wet. It's a technique I like because you get nice effects, nice and soft. However, if you want more detail, if you're a bit more precise, you might want to work what we call wet on dry. So you could leave the paper dry and put a lot more detail in, just using your paint straight onto the dry paper. But then you tend to get some harder edges. So it really depends on the techniques that you want to give a go to. But for today we're doing wet in wet. Okay, so that whole leaf now is nice and wet, or damp should I say. It's not dripping wet, it's just damp. And I'm going to start again with the gamboge, making it a little bit of a background to work onto, and I'm going to use it a little bit thicker than I did when we first set off in the background, because we want this leaf to be nice and bright compared to the background. So I'm just going to fill the whole thing in, following those pencil lines. Now can you see how I've gone over the line there, but actually, I mean, you could wipe that out if you wanted now with a little bit of damp water, but I'm going to leave it because it looks perhaps like it's a bit of shadow where that leaf's curling over, where the yellow's gone over the blue there, and that will fade as well when it starts drying. Okay, so we've got the whole thing painted yellow. Now I want to get some oranges into that, and I want to go a little bit brighter than it might be in you know, naturally, make it a little bit more funky. So I'm going to use a very bright red, but I'm not going to use it neat. I'm going to mix it into that yellow, make a very bright orange, which perhaps a little bit more dramatic than this leaf would be really. Now you will notice there that when I did that, I didn't add any extra water to the palette. I just added extra paint. You've always got to work, when you're working wet into wet, with a higher concentration of paint each time to water. Otherwise, the water disperses out into the paint that's already there and makes a mess. Because it's a higher concentration, it'll just blend in quite nicely. And we can still just see those veins through there. Because of where I've got my camera, so that you can see things, I'm finding my arm and my hand are at a bit of a funny angle. When you're painting, try and paint in the direction that things are growing. So if you're doing a tree, a flower, grass, anything like that, paint in the direction that that thing is growing. You'll find it much more natural. It'll look more natural when you're doing it. Okay, so I'm just going to put extra in certain places, because obviously leaves aren't, they're not uniform. They're going to have some darker areas and some lighter areas, so I'm just putting extra bits in. I'm not going to do the veins themselves, I'm going to do those later, but I'm just going to put some on some edges, more of this orange, just to give a bit of shape and form. And even brighter still with a little bit more extra pink. And just following some of those leaf shapes just to accentuate them. And the way that it's folding over at the top there. Now those are blending in quite nicely. If you don't feel that they're blending in as you would like, wet your brush, wash it, but then squeeze the excess out and just with a damp brush just carefully feather them in. But don't introduce any more water onto your paper. Okay, now I'm going to leave that one to dry before I put any veins in it. So whilst that's drying, I'll do these two, but I'll possibly speed the camera up a little bit whilst I do that, so that you don't get bored watching me. Okay, so now that I've done these two, this one's a little bit drier. It's not completely dry, it's just a little bit drier. If you look, there's a little bit of a glisten on it. It's not completely dry, so now I'm going to work on it again. So I know that the paint's not going to move too much, but it's going to move enough to make it nice and soft. These two, you'll notice I've put more water in the mix, and they're much looser than this one because these are more in the distance and this one is the focal point. So the colour for the stem, I'm going to use a burnt sienna. And to make it fit in with everything else, I'll just pop a bit of this earlier mix in with it, just to soften it a bit and make it match up with everything else that we've already got in there. So that's a nice browny colour there. And take the stem all the way into the leaf. You know, they're not two separate things, they're all part of the same plant. And at the end it's a little bit wider. Okay, so now we've got that there, I'm going to carry on and put some of the veins in. And all I'm doing now with these is following exactly where those pencil marks were earlier. So I've got my pencil marks there and I can just go along with those. You want to have more time than me to make sure that this is a neater drawing. Okay, now in places we probably want that stem to be a little bit darker. It's not going to be completely uniform, it's going to have a bit of light and shade in there. So I'm going to make that, first of all, make that mixture there more concentrated with more of the burnt sienna, and then I'm going to go and put some of the blue that we used earlier into it, and that will help make it darker. So by using the same blue and the same colours we used earlier, it's going to make the painting quite harmonious. It's going to make it all gel together nicely. So up to now we've only got 4 colours in here. It's a little bit darker there on the end. Might pop a bit of dark underneath, as if perhaps the light's coming from above and we've got a bit of shadow underneath the stem there. Okay, and I'm just going to make that line a bit straighter. I'm not very good at doing straight lines, so I'm just going to soften it off. And then I'm going to take some of that dark into there, just blend it in a bit better. And in 1 or 2 places it's a little bit darker where some of these leaves are a little bit damaged, you know, where they've got marked. You don't get to autumn and not have a few little dents and marks. Now I'm going to keep this quite loose. You might want to do, like I said earlier, do more detail. I've just left it wet on wet. You might want to work on that when it's dry and paint in more of the veins, paint in more, you know, over these little marks and things. But I'm quite happy to leave it like that for now, I think. We do need some stems on these earlier too though, don't we? So I'm going to make that colour lighter and more watery than I had it for doing this one. keep them leaves very, very loose. And again, I've made a mess with this one. I've made it too wide. It's not the easiest to have a steady hand when you're doing these. With this one, I don't know if you can tell, but it's sort of curved over, so I'm going to put more colour in the side that we can see that's nearest to us, so that it looks a bit more like it's curved over. And again, try and get rid of that line there that I made too big. Okay, now you might then think, well, actually the light's shining a bit more through that leaf than I've got it, and it needs a bit of a curve in it to accentuate the shape. So you can lift the paint out if you want whilst it's still wet damp and lighten some areas. Just to give it that shape that it's, you know, it's going over that way, curling over. And you can always use your tissue to lift some of that extra out. Okay, so I think, you know, it's one of those things that you could carry on and put extra detail into and go on and on. But I think for a first little beginner's exercise, that's probably enough. So something very, very simple with a very simple background and quite a simple shape that we can all draw. And, you know, just have a go with 2 or 3 colours, using the same colours in the background as you do in your leaves, just to make it nice and harmonious. Okay, so have fun with that. Let me know how you get on. Any questions, anything that I've not covered that you think I ought to have done? I'm just getting rid of that smudge there. You know, just ask. I'm quite happy to reply to any comments with any you know, advice that you want regarding your painting. Okay, so feel free to subscribe for more demonstrations and tutorials, and you can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter for updates on my own work and what I'm up to. Okay, so thanks for watching. Bye bye.